Well, today I've come to talk to you a little bit about aquatic plants and what role they play in lakes and both their benefits and drawbacks of aquatic plant communities. So aquatic plants are also known as macrophytes. So if I kind of switch in between the term macrophytes and aquatic plants throughout the presentation, I'm talking about the same thing here. It's just a fancy science word to say plants that live in the water and that you can see with your naked eye. So why do we care so much about aquatic plants? To many people, they're just a nuisance. They get in the way. They foul up lake shores. But they really do provide many benefits to the lake ecosystem as a whole and to all the animals and fish and people that live on the lakes. So diverse native plant communities are very important. They're really the foundation of healthy, balanced lake ecosystems. They provide many numerous benefits to all sorts of wildlife. They serve as food for waterfowl and for all sorts of different mammal species. They also provide shelter for things like fish and aquatic insects. In addition, they also provide nurseries for many spawning fish and for frogs and tadpoles and salamanders, dragonflies. They all need aquatic plants in order to complete their life cycle so that they can thrive from year to year. So here's a little cross-section diagram of a typical lake. And we can see that we start off here in the kind of near-shore area, and I'll try to hit both screens if, we're going on both sides here. And those are the terrestrial plants. So these are things like trees and shrubs and your kind of flowers that you think of that live on land. Then the next kind of step that we have are our emergent plants. And emergent plants are plants that are rooted really close to the water, if not directly in the water, in shallower waters. And these are things such as cattails, different sedges, bulrushes. So these emergent plants really provide really great nearshore habitat for shelter, and also for certain species need to complete their life cycles on these emergent plants. In addition, we have floating plants. So this is kind of the next step out. These are things like water lilies, different burr reeds, duckweeds. So again, this kind of is that next transition zone out into the lake, and again, providing numerous benefits for many species. These plants also help to prevent wave action. So if you have strong waves coming in, a lot of these floating plants can kind of absorb that energy, and then we don't get things like shoreline erosion and loss of our actual near-shore terrestrial property. In addition, we have different submerged species. So again, there's probably about 50 or 60 unique species of pondweeds that we have here in Wisconsin. We also have different waterweeds and elodea, coontail. And so again, these species really provide that next level out into the lake, into that littoral zone where plants are able to grow. So this is a little fact from the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. And it says that 90% of all lake life is born, raised, and fed in the area where land and water meet. So those first couple of feet where your property stops and the lake stops is really critically important for survival of many, many different species of fish and birds and animals. So just a little bit of kind of Plant 101 here. This might take you back to your high school biology classes. We're going to talk about photosynthesis. So how do these aquatic plants grow? They're very similar to the way terrestrial plants grow, and they have some basic requirements. First off is sunlight. Aquatic plants need light to grow. If they do not have light, they will not grow very well. So sunlight, the amount of sunlight that can penetrate in the water column is determined by things such as how turbid the water is, how much sediment's stirred up in it, what color the water is. Sometimes waters are naturally stained, a brown or red color. And then again, too, if there's many days of cloudiness, that particular plant species isn't getting the sunlight that it needs to grow and to thrive. In addition, seems a little silly, but aquatic plants do need water. So this isn't a limiting resource for them. They're typically surrounded by water on all sides. But things like emergent plants that are maybe rooted in water might be limited if the water table is fluctuating or if the plants get kind of stranded up on dry land. In addition, aquatic plants need carbon dioxide. So these plants take in carbon dioxide and they process that into sugars that they can use to grow, and then their byproduct is oxygen. And so oxygen obviously is what we all need to live and what all the aquatic critters need to live as well in the water. And in addition, plants need nutrients. Specifically, plants need phosphorus and nitrogen. Without these nutrients, they can't grow and thrive. However, on the flip side of things, if they get too much of this nutrients, they can really grow and thrive very quickly and can actually cause pretty dense problems. Aquatic plants also face a unique challenge in that they have to reproduce. So from year to year, you want the plant population to come back every year. And they've kind of come up with some unique strategies to kind of get around this. Most of our terrestrial plants are pollinated by things like bees and flies and things that can fly from plant to plant and to kind of pass that genetic material around. So plants kind of use a couple unique adaptations to this. One thing that they do is they actually can spread by fragmentation. So you can take a portion of certain plants and it will actually sprout new roots and it can form a brand new plant. So we can see in this picture up here that these fragments were kind of floating around and they set down new roots. And so now when this particular piece of plant gets trapped into sediment or into an area that's good for it to grow, it can actually form an entire new plant just from that little fragment. In addition, plants grow by things known as rhizomes and tubers. And these are underground structures that basically are, they hold starch and carbohydrates. So even though the vegetative parts of the plant, something like a lily pad, might die back over winter time, these tubers and rhizomes are buried in the sediment, and then when conditions are right, when the ice comes off the following year and the water starts to warm again, these plants can grow from these kind of overwintering rhizomatous structures. In addition, turions are another sort of way that they can reproduce. And this is just a vegetative propagule where the plant basically shrinks itself down into a little ball of energy, and then that can sort of stay dormant in the sediment. And again, when conditions are right, that turion can expand out and a new plant will form again. Some plants do produce seeds and flowers. Oftentimes they do stick above the water surface. So occasionally if you're out on a lake, you'll see tiny little spikes that are just sticking an inch or two above the water surface. In addition, we have a couple unique species of plants that actually produce spores. And these plants are very evolutionarily old. They're more related to ferns and things like that than our true vascular plants as we think of them. And then in addition, many of these plants can reproduce by budding or sort of clonal reproduction. So things like duckweeds, you can actually have a single piece of duckweed and it'll sort of send out different vegetative kind of growths off of the plant, and then that part can break off and form a whole new plant. So I'm going to get into some of the general benefits of aquatic plants, and then we're going to go into some of the drawbacks that aquatic plants can also have to our enjoyment and recreation of lakes. Like I mentioned before, aquatic plants provide excellent habitat for a variety of critters. Can anyone see the critter in this particular picture? Kind of hiding up in here, but we got a frog that's somewhere in between these lily pads and these emergent vegetations in the nearshore zone. And this also provides shade. There's certain fish species that when they're spawning, their eggs cannot get too warm, otherwise they're not going to be reproductively successful. So they need this sort of shade and cover in order to be successful in producing additional generations. Again, aquatic plants provide excellent food sources for a wide variety of different species. We have many waterfowl that subsist almost entirely on different aquatic plants. So they eat the seeds, they eat those tubers, sometimes they even eat the vegetation itself. Different mammals, muskrats and deer and moose and otters and all sorts of different aquatic mammals also need vegetation as part of their diet. Different reptiles, we have snapping turtles that eat quite a bit of vegetation. And then us too, actually. Aquatic plants were used for centuries by Native Americans and settlers that were moving into Wisconsin. And still today, many people go out and collect things like wild rice or arrowhead tubers, and that's a a way that we actually also use aquatic plants as a food source. Aquatic plants provide oxygen for all sorts of animals. Through that photosynthetic process, once again, they take in that carbon dioxide that's in the water, and then their byproduct is oxygen. And without that oxygen, none of the animals that live underwater would be able to survive because they all need oxygen just like we do. A really important point here is that aquatic plants really help to stabilize the sediment. They reduce wave and erosion action. So here we have a very diverse plant community where we have different floating leaf plants out in the middle, and then we have also these sort of emergent cattails in the background. So when something like a motorboat comes by, or we have a very windy day, especially on a lake as large as Winnebago, where we can know that it gets pretty wavy out there on certain days, having these aquatic plants help prevent that near-shore area where all of our properties are from being eroded over time by these kind of repeated wave events. Aquatic plants can also improve water clarity and quality. Like I mentioned before, they have to uptake things such as phosphorus and nitrogen. And if these aquatic plants don't take up the phosphorus and nitrogen, then other things that live in the water column are able to. So there's many species of native algae that are in our lakes. And oftentimes if we have excess phosphorus and nitrogen and we don't have plants to take that up, we can get these really severe algal blooms that happen. In addition, aquatic plants are really well known to remove certain pollutants from the water. So they can actually take out heavy metals and things that are kind of washed into the watershed inadvertently through our human actions, and they can actually sequester those into the plant itself so that it's not available in the water anymore for other organisms to swim around in. In addition, native aquatic plants can help prevent the invasion of exotic plants. If you have a very healthy native plant community and an exotic species gets introduced, it's not going to really be able to find sort of a habitat for it to grow in if you already have native plants that are occupying that state. So here you can see a picture of a lake with a kind of a newer infestation of a plant known as Eurasian Watermilfoil, which is a very aggressive non-native species that's been spreading throughout Wisconsin. And you can see that since there were no native plants in this kind of outer zone here, that the plant just really took off, and it can just top out and grow and can really cause some major recreational issues. In addition, aquatic plants provide very many opportunities for us, whether it be hunting or fishing or bird watching, any sort of wildlife sort of watching. Many times when we're doing these activities, we're looking for areas that have aquatic plants to fish along a weed line or hunt in a duck line and cattails. And then too, I sort of love aquatic plants. I've been doing this for 7 years now, and despite the fact that we usually see them in a pretty negative aspect, many of them can actually be quite beautiful. These are all native plants to Wisconsin that live in our lakes, and you can see that many of them have very pretty flowers and other reproductive parts that can really provide some natural beauty to your shoreline. Okay, so that's a lot of benefits about native plants. So let's talk about some of the drawbacks. So we're out on our lake, we want to go out, we want to go water skiing, we want to go fishing, swimming. And aquatic plants can get dense under certain conditions, especially when we have things such as excess nutrients, or the humans have really modified the landscape so that lake isn't as natural as it used to be. So aquatic plants can tangle up on your prop, and they can catch onto your keels of your sailboats. I know I've been on many a lakes where I've had to stop every so often and remove the plants from my prop to even continue moving across the lake because the vegetation is very, very thick. In addition, this can discourage things such as swimming and recreation. Oftentimes these dense plants of dense plant beds will catch other things that are floating by, such as algae and maybe dead fish and things like that. And these can really start to cause odors as the plant starts to decompose. No one wants to swim in something like that. And it can really reduce the aesthetic quality as well. If you kind of have your mind, your pier and your perfect lake day, and you get out there and it's top full of aquatic plants, that can really inhibit the value of your property as well. And of course, it costs money and it takes a lot of time and effort to deal with aquatic plant issues. And with a lake like Winnebago, it's incredibly complex. Most of the lakes in Wisconsin are about 10 to 20 acres. Winnebago is a huge system, and it's incredibly diverse and complex to try to deal with these aquatic plant issues on a lake-wide scale. And just to kind of reemphasize that point a little bit, here is Lake Winnebago and the kind of watershed that surrounds this lake. And you can see that there's a couple major cities that are involved in this watershed. In addition, this sort of tan color is all farmland and grassland. So this system has a lot of agricultural input that's coming in from either farmers directly applying fertilizers to their land, or where that native vegetation used to be has now been removed, and so when things like runoff events and snowmelt happens, all of this land use is being drained into Lake Winnebago. So whatever sort of applied to the land will eventually end up in the lake. And again, if we look at a little bit of data on sort of what nutrients are currently being found in Lake Winnebago, this is some actual data taken from pretty close to where we are right now at the south end of the lake. You can see that we're sort of bordering right here between what we know as eutrophic and hypereutrophic. And eutrophic lakes are usually very dense in plant growth. They have excess nutrients so the plants can absorb them up and they can get pretty dense. When you start to kind of go above this line to hypereutrophic, you sort of flip your system, where things like algae and blue-green algae and things that are actually going to grow very, very dense and thick can actually shade out that native plant community. And then when you lose all of your plants, which really can be problematic, and especially in a lake the size of Winnebago. So next what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get a little bit into some of the plant species which are found on Lake Winnebago. This is really beneficial because if there are issues that are arising and there's concerns that we have to kind of know what sort of species we're talking about here. There's many native species in Lake Winnebago, but there's also a couple non-native species that we also want to make sure we're managing correctly and we're not actually increasing the spread of these species around the lake. So the first one I'm going to talk about is something known as wild celery. The scientific name is Vallisneria americana. And this is a very popular plant throughout the entire state of Wisconsin. And it kind of forms these long ribbon-like leaves that kind of go out from a central root mass that's below the sediment. Oftentimes it produces these kind of unique spiral-like flowers that you can sometimes see if you're boating around. And that's another way that this particular species overwinters from year to year. And this plant is really an excellent source of food for waterfowl. The scientific name for the canvasback duck actually has Vallisneria in it because this species eats so much of it that it's actually more or less dependent on this plant to survive from year to year. It also provides really good habitat for different fish species, especially young year fish species or smaller fish that kind of are hanging out in the near littoral zone. Another plant that's, once again, very common and can be problematic in certain lakes is a plant known as coontail. And coontail are kind of these long, kind of bushy-like plants that have a central stem, and each of the leaves fork about 2 to 3 times. You can kind of look at them as like a wishbone, like you would have from your turkey. And each fork has little tiny teeth on the end of it as well. And this plant actually doesn't have true roots. So unlike some of our other plant species that are rooted in the sediment, they're growing there, they're not going to be somewhere else the next day, this species actually has the ability to move around with things such as waves. So oftentimes we'll see after a big storm event or a big kind of wave event that this plant will get pushed into areas such as bays or near shore areas where it can, continue to grow in these areas again. It is also able to kind of overwinter as an evergreen species. For any of you guys or girls that like to go ice fishing, oftentimes I'll find this when we go ice fishing and it just seems to kind of go dormant. It's not actively growing, but it still provides some structure through those winter months when a lot of the other native plant species die back. And again, provides a variety of habitat and food sources for aquatic insects and waterfowl. Another very common plant is common waterweed, also known as Elodea. And the distinguishing characteristic with this particular plant are that the leaves are in groups of threes. So again, it's kind of have this long stem with these 3 leaves whirled along the center of the stem. And again, this plant has the tendency to evergreen in certain situations. And it also really doesn't form true roots in many cases. It kind of forms smaller roots that might loosely anchor it to the sediment, but it does tend to shift around a lot with species such as Coontail. In addition, again, emphasizing just the importance of these plants to things such as mammals, waterfowl, and aquatic insects. Again, another very common plant, this is Sago pondweed. It has these very long sort of thread-like leaves. They almost look like pine needles. And when you look at it in the water, it tends to have this kind of bushy appearance. Another common name for it is actually bushy pondweed. Again, it produces prolific seeds. Oftentimes we'll see a flock of waterfowl that lands on a lake, and it's just eating all these sago seeds as quickly as it possibly can. It's just a really high energy, beneficial seed for this particular, for all sorts of critters. Another native plant we have here is clasping leaf pondweed. And this one really has quite a bit of structure, especially for things such as fish communities. Again, we have kind of this long central stem that's rising up from the sediment where it's actually rooted. And then it's got these sort of green, wavy-ish leaves that are coming off alternately from the stem. And hence the common name, the clasping leaf pondweed. This species tends to sort of clasp around the stem almost halfway to 3/4 of the way, like it's giving it a hug almost. And again, just provides really great cover, especially for larger fish. Okay, so all the species I discussed so far are native plants that, under most circumstances are very beneficial to lakes. So now we're going to talk about 2 exotic species that were introduced over from Europe, actually many, many decades ago, and over the past few years have been really spreading around Wisconsin and causing a lot of issues. And the reason these plants cause issues is that when they were introduced to Wisconsin, their natural predators weren't introduced with them. So these species can really grow unchecked, and there's nothing that really regulates how much, nothing really feeds on them. They're not really beneficial cover for a lot of our aquatic plants, or excuse me, aquatic critters. So these are species that we want to keep an eye out for and really manage so that they can't take over our lakes. So this first one here is Eurasian Watermilfoil. Like I mentioned, this is an exotic species introduced from Europe. The identifying characteristics for this particular plant are that there are 4 feather-like leaves which are surrounding a long stem. So here you can see in the bottom there's 1 leaf, and then here are those 4 leaflets, or 4 leaves that are surrounding 1 stem. And the way to identify Eurasian Watermilfoil is actually to count the number of leaflets that are on an individual stem. So what we do in the field is we actually count each one of these tiny little sort of branches off to the side of an individual leaf. And the magic number for one side is anywhere between 12 and 20 leaflets on 1 individual leaf per side. And the reason this is important is we have a couple native watermilfoils that are beneficial, and they do serve a good value in the aquatic plant community. And they have differing characteristics. They typically always have less than 12. So 12 or more, you probably want to make sure someone sees that sample. It could be Eurasian Watermilfoil. Usually if you have less than 12, it's probably one of the beneficial native species, which can be a little tricky to identify. Oftentimes this plant can really grow, it grows up to the water surface and then it continues growing almost parallel with the water surface, and it can branch multiple times. And this is one of those species that spreads really well by fragmentation. So if you run your motor through a bed of this and you scatter fragments all over, that wherever the wind and the water currents are going to take those fragments is you can establish an entirely new population somewhere else in the lake where that plant wasn't currently growing before. The first record from Lake Winnebago that I could track down was 1992, so it's been established for about 20 or so years. And like I mentioned, in many lakes that I study, it can really form dense monocultures that exclude all other sort of beneficial plants, and it can really degrade your recreational value as well. The other bad guy we're going to talk about is Curlyleaf Pondweed. Again, this is a species that was introduced overseas. It was actually a very popular aquarium plant many decades ago, and everyone imported it, and they got spread around Wisconsin. And the kind of unique identifying characteristic for this particular species are these kind of wavy lasagna-like noodles. So you can see here's an individual leaf here. It's got that very waved structure. And in addition, if you kind of get close up to the leaf edge, it's actually serrate like a knife. Oftentimes you can see this with your naked eye. Otherwise, if you had some sort of a hand lens or something like that, that can also help aid in identification. And it forms these sort of pine cone-like turions that it actually overwinters on. So sometimes you might see these washed up on your shore or floating in the water column. And again, this is that sort of reproductive structure so that when this turion finds a better place to live, it can settle in, and once again, it can grow a brand new plant just from that little floating turion. Curlyleaf is pretty unique in that it actually emerges very early in the growing season. Most curlyleaf pondweed surveys and treatments are actually happening right now. So this plant tends to start almost growing under the ice. Once ice comes off and the sunlight's able to penetrate in, this plant just shoots up to the surface and can really form some very dense beds. The unique thing about this plant is that it also tends to die back pretty early in the growing season. So oftentimes, especially for summer residents, they might not even know this plant is in their lake because they haven't even gotten up to their cabin yet for the summer. So sometimes as early as Memorial Day, this plant will actually die back. And with that dieback, it releases a lot of nutrients back into the water column. So little aquatic insects start breaking the plant down, bacteria breaks it down, and then all these nutrients are available in the water column again, and this can fuel things such as algal blooms and excessive native plant growth. And again, just these turions, once this plant gets into your lake, it can take many years to deplete this turion bed. This species, we've been, in a couple systems I've studied, we've been trying to go after it for 5 or 6 years pretty aggressively, and it just, the turion bank is so thick that, you know, we get rid of as much as we can every year, but it's got the seed bank that's set up where, you know, it's really difficult to control once it's in a system. A couple additional resources here for aquatic plants. The UW Extension Lakes page that I have the address for at the bottom here is really a great website to go to learn anything about aquatic plants. They have different aquatic plant management rules there. They have different resources. This Through the Looking Glass book here is also available on their website. And that's just a really great sort of basic book on how to identify aquatic plants that, you know, you may see in your lake or might be curious on what you have in front of your property. In addition, one of our colleagues, Paul Skwinski, has also written a photographic book of aquatic plants. So this is pretty nice because it's got pictures of all the plants and it's really easy to use. In addition, there's the UW-Madison Herbarium that you can actually type in your lake and see whether or not what species are growing on your lake and who found them and when they were found and all sorts of different records. So with that, I'd like to just acknowledge a couple of people. Dr. Susan Knight, she's an excellent plant lady up in northern Wisconsin. She's sort of the plant guru. Provided a lot of guidance for myself learning aquatic plants many years ago. Paul Skwinski and Sue Graham also provide a lot of the photos. We have Gary Fulis and Dr. Bob Freckman. They run the herbariums in Wisconsin. And then Frank and Bob are also just excellent, both retired DNR employees that are still very passionate about aquatic plants and lakes. So with that, I think I am done. And I don't know if you want to take some questions now. So if anyone has any questions or clarifications, and I should mention too that Ted is going to talk a lot more about the management side of things and different strategies that we can deal with trying to control aquatic plants. So we can kind of both benefit ourselves by being able to enjoy the lake and our resources, but also making sure we're not harming some of those animals and fish that are really dependent on those aquatic plants. So any questions? Take you there. Good question. Yeah, the question was, what is the depth of the littoral zone? And again, the littoral zone is the area of the lake where plants can survive. And the depth really is dependent about light penetration. So littoral zones can vary anywhere from half a foot deep to about 40 feet deep. So if you have a very, very clear lake, let's say a small seepage, a small like tiny lake in northern Wisconsin, we can find plants growing out to 30, 40 feet deep in these systems because the water is so clear that the light can penetrate all the way down to the bottom of these systems. With a lake like Lake Winnebago, the water clarity is probably about 3 or 4 feet deep that you can see down into the water column. So plants might grow anywhere between 6 to 10 feet or so. It's usually about the Secchi or the water clarity depth, and then maybe a little bit deeper than that. And that can really vary from year to year too, and throughout the growing season. Right now our lakes are all pretty clear because there isn't a lot of algal bloom that's happening. And then later in the season we might actually find that plants don't grow quite as deep as they did earlier in the year. Other questions? Yes.
When you did benefits of plants, this the opposite. They were only humans. Is that the case? That there's no disadvantage?
No, that's actually a really good point. I would say that, yes, sorry. The question was talking about kind of the drawbacks of aquatic plants, and many of the items that I listed were drawbacks to us as humans. So the question was, how do these dense aquatic plants affect different aquatic animals and fish that need it? And they can have some adverse effects as well, especially some of these invasive species, such as Eurasian Watermilfoil, where animals tend to not use that as habitat, and there aren't species that can use it for spawning, or dragonflies don't know kind of what to do with the plant. In addition, if you have very dense aquatic beds, sometimes they're so dense that aquatic or things such as fish and stuff can't really use them as great habitat. If they're wall-to-wall plants and there's no room to kind of swim in between them, the fish might not use that as a preferred habitat as well. However, on the contrary, a lot of our kind of predatory fish, things like pike, they love that kind of really thick aquatic plant bed because they like to hang out right at the edge of that, so they can kind of use that as their ambush. But there are things, it's not really well studied. I think, we kind of try to focus on the human side of things because the humans mostly complain about the dense plants, and it really can vary, I think, about the effects on your native plants and animals. Yes?
You mentioned that some of these invasive species were brought here, but their predators do not walk with them. What do you mean by predators for something like Eurasian Watermilfoil? In their native areas, what would have controlled them?
Sure. The question was, I mentioned with invasive species that the reason that they're usually invasive when they get brought to a new environment is that a lot of their natural predators and what sort of keeps them in check were not brought along with them. And with aquatic plants, especially something like Eurasian Watermilfoil, a lot of times they're utilized by aquatic insects. So there's different weevil species and beetles that will actually burrow into the stems, and that will actually cause the plant to collapse if it's getting very thick. In addition, there's there's aquatic mammals over in Europe that actually love Eurasian Watermilfoil, and they have it as a preferred food source over there, and it loves to eat the seeds and gobble up the rhizomes and things like that. different waterfowl species that are present in Europe also might, prefer something like curlyleaf pondweed. Those turions can be a really great food source if you know what they are and how to eat them. But a lot of our native ducks don't really understand that. Then back. The question was on Lake Winnebago, which aquatic plants typically interfere with props. And I think that can really vary from year to year quite a bit. Eurasian Watermilfoil is the notorious one for getting tangled up on props because it has these really, really long stems that you can imagine just get twisted over and over again, and it can actually prevent your prop from spinning. But any of these plants in the right sort of situations can cause nuisance conditions. Coontail is one that, especially when there's excess nutrients that are available to the plant, it can really grow in these thick mats. And if you happen to catch a mat, as you're trying to leave your pier, or if you're boating around the lake, that can also slow you down quite a bit. But any of these kind of submerged species, typically we don't think of the emergent plants or the floating leaf plants really causing a lot of navigational issues. Sometimes things like water lilies can, but usually you can get through those if you have to get through a small patch. Yep, follow up. Okay, the question was generally how serious would Eurasian Watermilfoil be compared to Coontail? And again, I'm going to kind of go back to the fallback of it really matters on the year and the situation. It's such a huge complex system that the southern end of Lake Winnebago might be dealing with Coontail because it all gets blown down there in wind events, and the northern end might have really dense Eurasian Watermilfoil. And the two can coexist together too. It's not like they necessarily exclude each other from growing out, but there has been, a couple different plant studies done on Lake Winnebago, but with a lake of its size, it's really difficult to, to really collect enough information to make kind of general comments as a whole. So I think both can be problematic. Yes?
We continue to hear about the phosphorus level, the elevated phosphorus level in the farmers. But the chart that you had up really didn't portray any elevation in phosphorus for all the years that you've taken the study.
Sure. So the question was, when we looked at that trophic status graph about, with the nutrients, when you kind of increase them, you can kind of flip from a plant-dominated to an algal-dominated state. And I think it's important to note that those were actually summertime averages. So sometimes you might have an extreme, event or two that can really drive the lake. If you have all this phosphorus coming in, let's say, April and May, where this graph sort of did the July to August, and I'm not quite sure how many samples were taken to get that average. This is just a graph that I pulled off of a DNR kind of self-reporting website. So I think Ted will talk a little bit more about the phosphorus issue out here in 3 locations. Yes.
Are there only 2 non-native plants that we have to deal with?
So the question was, are there only 2 non-native plants that we have to deal with? Those are the 2 plants that are known from Lake Winnebago. However, there are many other non-native aquatic plants that are present in Wisconsin. Unfortunately, many of them have popped up in the last couple years too. And kind of a separate project that I've been part of is we've actually made a law that restricts certain plant species from being sold in the state. There's worse guys than these guys out there that are just at our doorstep. Some of you might have heard of a plant called hydrilla, and hydrilla is just a notorious plant for growing very dense, topping out, and it's, in Florida, they've given up boating in many of these lakes. That's why you see those fan boats, because they can't even get their prop in the water to get through these mats. There's things such as water hyacinth, water lettuce, these kind of free-floating species. I think one of them actually was found somewhere near Lake Winnebago where someone thought it was a very attractive plant, and they introduced it to a natural water body, which is illegal to do. And thankfully someone saw this plant and we were able to remove it before it got into a big system like Winnebago or it caused more economic damage. So, you know, it's always good to be vigilant. If there's something that you see and you don't know what it is or it looks like it's acting strangely, you know, we have many regional people that can probably identify what the plant is, maybe even through a picture. But we're always kind of looking for the next invader, and you know, there's some pretty bad ones that they're in Michigan and they're in Illinois and they're, you know, creeping their way in ever so slowly. So we're trying to prevent that from happening. Yes.
The water clarity in the lake in the weed growth seems to have the water clarity improved in the last 10 years. But this is just first observation.
Sure. So the question was, with the last couple of years, there's been a trend that the lake's been a little bit clearer, and so how does that kind of affect the weed growth? And again, this is a pretty complicated question where we have things such as zebra mussels, again, that are found in Lake Winnebago, and zebra mussels are known to filter feed out things such as, you know, little tiny aquatic plants and kind of that plankton and phytoplankton that really is the basis of the food chain. So it could be possible that the zebra mussels are actually kind of creating an artificially clear water system. We've seen that documented in a couple other lakes where they've been introduced, where you know, it tends to clear up the water, but it's very temporary, because once again, if you're taking out that bottom of the food chain, all of a sudden you don't have that available for things such as small fish and aquatic bugs, and sort of a short-sighted water clarity. But there has been a lot of work that's been done in the watershed to try to prevent these excess nutrients from being introduced into the lake. Does that answer your question a little bit? I would say a plant-dominated lake, in my opinion, is always going to be better than a hyper-eutrophic algal-dominated lake, because once again, if you remove all that structure from the lake, all those plants, and you just have algae, certain species of blue-green algae can actually be toxic too. So we don't want to be swimming in blue-green algae because we can actually get sick from that as well. So in my opinion, I think that it's healthier just based upon the aquatic plant community in itself. Other questions or? Yes.
You have to remember that the sewer is almost completely on the lake now, and I mean that was a big factor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
How did the exotic species get into the lake?
So the question was, how did the aquatic species get here and into the lake to begin with? And actually, with a plant like Eurasian Watermilfoil, it does go back to the ocean liners. So that particular species was brought in and introduced to the Great Lakes. You had fishermen and boaters and recreational people out on Lake Michigan with their boats, enjoying a weekend out there. They brought their boat from something like Lake Michigan into Lake Winnebago, and that boat had those aquatic plants tangled up on the trailer or on the prop. And then that plant is introduced into Lake Winnebago, and with a plant like Eurasian Watermilfoil that can produce from just these really tiny fragments, that was just enough to get that plant established in the lake. Certain other species are brought in through things like the aquarium and water garden trade. So a lot of these newer species that we're seeing popping up are actually intentionally being introduced in Wisconsin by folks that think, they have, aesthetic appeal or that they're pretty plants, but they don't realize that they're doing quite a bit of harm by introducing these plants into these systems where they don't belong. Sure. The comment was that, you know, we do find these invasive plants oftentimes in smaller areas such as farm ponds or things that don't get a lot of boat traffic. And wildlife can move these plants around too. It's not incredibly well documented, but you can imagine a milfoil fragment getting tucked up under a duck's, you know, feet when it's flying, or you know, we've had a couple private ponds where we found some of these invasive species, and people order things off the internet and they think they're ordering some beneficial aquatic plant, and that plant might come, but it might have a couple other plants that are tucked up with it. You know, a lot of these nurseries, they grow all different sorts of plants. And we did have hydrilla was actually documented in a farm pond that way, where you know, it was unintentionally kind of a hitchhiker in a beneficial plant that was trying to be established.